Hi, and welcome back to another Basics of Music Theory lesson. We're pretty much just going to tie up a few of the last loose ends we have with rhythm here, and then we'll be pretty much all done with everything you need to know about understanding the theory of rhythm in Western music in order to start looking at classical music at least. Now, for starters, I want to go over how do you tell whether to tie something together, whether to make it of the full note value, how do you beam things, and so for that we have these two measures right here. Now, if you look, these are the same measures, only this one implies kind of a duple feel, and this one implies a quadruple feel. Now, because this one has a duple feel, we're going to essentially treat it like we have two main beats. Even if we count it differently than that, we have beat 1, which is these four eighth notes and eighth rests, and we have this one, which is two eighth notes and a quarter note. Now, because this is all part of the same duple feel, we have these two eighth notes being together. Now, this note could be written as a quarter note, but because there's a separation in the beat, we want to write an eighth note tied to an eighth note. That way it's very clear to the player that we have a beat over here and a beat over here, and it just makes it really easy for them to tell the difference. Now, because this quarter note is all within this second beat feel over here, we write it as a quarter note instead of an eighth note tied to an eighth note. Over here we have more of a quadruple feel, and so these two eighth notes are not tied together. Once again, this one is tied to, this eighth note is tied to that eighth note, and that is because we still have a division in the beat right here, and we still want to make that clear. But over here, what was a quarter is now an eighth note tied to an eighth, because we want to show clearly that this is separate from this. And that's just, and you can apply this to when figuring out whether to write a dotted quarter or a quarter note tied to an eighth, and in terms of figuring out what rests to use, whether to use, say, a quarter rest or two eighth rests. It's a little bit differently depending on how you want the beaming between notes to work, but the principle stays the same with rests. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about something different, which is odd groupings. You don't so much see this in classical music, but in music after the 1900s, it starts to pop up, only because instead of having our kind of straight 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and feel, you might have this common syncopation of 1 and 2 and, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and there are other ways to group a measure of 4/4, obviously, even if it's all eighth notes, but this just makes it very clear that there's an implied stress on the 1, the and of 2, and the 4. Like I said, it's still not super common, but it's something you might see, or you might see something like a dotted quarter rest over here instead of these three notes, and then continue on as if you're in just a straight duple or quadruple meter. Now that our music has become a little bit more syncopated, you might start to see some of these odd groupings if you're playing more current music. It just kind of depends. I thought I'd bring it up just so if you stumble across it, you're not totally confused. My goodness, what is this? Now, this leads us very nicely into talking about asymmetric meters. Now, before we talked about simple and compound meters, asymmetric meters don't break up so easily. It's things like 7/8. And I have three different examples of how you might group 7/8. I have 4/3, I have 3 and 4, or you have 2, 3 and 2. All of these are valid, and these become asymmetric meters become a little bit more questionable. How do I count this? How do I write this out? And there's a little bit more interpretation to it. You do what makes sense to you. Now, a related idea is the idea of additive meters. And I'm just going to make one change to this just to make it a little bit clearer what's happening is you have 1/4, and then 3/8 notes. And it's, once again, if you look, this is basically this, only we have this as two quarter notes instead of basically 1/2 note. But yeah, and you just look at the side and you see, okay, 1/4, 3/8 notes. And that's how you know things get broken up. Oftentimes the 3/8 or the 3 whatever might imply some kind of compound feel over here. So if that were to say 6/8, maybe I'd have three 3/8 notes, but two groupings of 3/8 notes. It varies a little bit, and once again, you don't really see additive measures or additive time signatures until after the 1900s. The last thing I want to talk about is in Western music, how counting generally happens. And I have just this group of 4/4, or this time signature of 4/4. You can see it's just 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and if it was triplet, I would get rid of the E and it would become 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and now, Western music doesn't like things that break into groupings other than fours and or twos and threes, really. Fours are only fine because they're close enough to twos. And so that leaves you with some questions when you're dealing with a measure of 7/8. And so what I would generally do is I'll either count it one of two ways. Say I'm over here, I might count this as 1 and 2 and 3 and so just take where are my beats, or where does it feel like I have beats, and then everything smaller than that is some kind of subdivision. What you might also do, and I've done this for really fast, when I have to count really fast of a certain type of asymmetric meter, is I might just count 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And just 1 is always where the accent is. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Either of those can kind of work. It's really up to you to experiment. What I've recently been looking into is conical, which is a type of Indian way of teaching rhythm, and it's really interesting, really fascinating. I've just started looking into it, and so I don't feel comfortable really giving much information on it, but it has ways to count asymmetric meters, and it's really cool. But yeah, so at this point, you pretty much know everything you need to know to have the basics of rhythm down really well. So I hope this part of the basics series, if you will, has been extremely useful to you, and I hope you come back soon. Alright, have a great day.